The hand that pressed against the limestone was not young. The knuckles were thick, the skin loose across the back, the veins visible like rivers mapped beneath parchment. Clara Whitmore was 63 years old, and her hands showed every year of it. She had delivered babies with these hands, set broken bones, held the wrists of dying men to feel the last flutter of pulse before she recorded the time. She had learned over 30 years of rural nursing in South Dakota that the body does not lie. It signals, it warns, it tells the truth in the language of temperature and pressure and the quality of stillness. So when she pressed her palm flat against the cave wall on that July afternoon and felt the stone's impossible coolness radiating back into her skin, she did not dismiss it. She stood there for a long moment, the summer heat pressing against her back from the open mouth of the cave, and she listened to what the stone was telling her. Outside, the air sat at roughly 71 degrees. She knew this because she had checked Harold's thermometer less than 10 minutes earlier, holding it in the shade of a pine near the creek before beginning the climb up the limestone slope. 71 degrees and humid, the kind of July afternoon that made the Black Hills shimmer and the creek look silver and exhausted. Inside the cave, it was something else entirely. Not cold in any threatening way, not damp or hostile, just calm, steady, the way a room feels when the temperature has not changed in a very long time. Clara took the thermometer from her apron pocket and held it still inside the cave, away from any air moving through the entrance. She counted to 60 the way she had always counted, when taking a patient's temperature slow and deliberate, her lips moving slightly. Then she read the number, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. She looked at the number for a moment, then looked up at the cave's ceiling, the way the limestone arched without drama or decoration, just solid and gray and quietly enormous. She looked at the walls, the way the rock face showed its layers like the pages of a compressed and ancient book. She looked at the floor where the stone rose slightly above the level of the cave's entrance, a natural lip of perhaps 8 inches that would keep cold air pooled inside rather than draining out. She was not a geologist. She was a nurse. But 30 years of understanding the body had taught her that enclosed systems follow rules, and that the rules do not bend for hope or desperation. They simply are. She took out the small notebook she kept in her left apron pocket, the one she had used for patient notes and medication records, and the small calculations that rural medicine required, and she wrote the date, the time, and 2 numbers. 71 outside, 58 inside. Then she wrote one sentence beneath them. Check again in the morning. Lily was crouched near the back of the cave, examining a crack in the floor with the focused gravity that 4-year-olds bring to the smallest things. She had found the cave first, pulling free of Clara's hand on the slope and disappearing into the shadows before Clara could call her back. It was the child's laughter bouncing off limestone that had drawn Clara in after her. "Grandma, it's cool in here," the little girl had called out, and Clara had followed both the voice and the cool air inside. Lily's parents were 6 weeks dead. Clara did not allow herself to think about that in complete sentences. She thought about it the way you think about a wound during an emergency. You are aware of it, you note its location, you understand it will require full attention later, but right now there is another problem that requires your hands. The other problem always was Lily. The child needed food and warmth, and the sense that the world had not become entirely unreliable. Clara was the last person standing between Lily and that unreliability, and she had no intention of failing the assignment. She had also done the mathematics with a precision that left no room for comfort. $14 was what she had. She had counted it 3 times on the morning after she first understood that no one else was coming to take the child. $14 in mixed coin and a single folded bill. The cost of passage south to the nearest railhead with a child was $22 minimum, and that assumed nothing went wrong along the way. The cost of lodging in Deadwood until she could find work was money she did not have, and the work available to a woman of 63 with a 4-year-old attached was not the kind of work that added up to $22 quickly. She had seen what happened to women in Deadwood who ran out of calculations. She had nursed some of them. She knew exactly what that particular ending looked like. Going home to Iowa was the option that had seemed briefly like a door. Her brother James lived on a farm outside Cedar Rapids, a solid man with a solid life and a letter-writing habit that conveyed affection in the cautious, measured way of people who were raised not to make a fuss. His letter had arrived 3 weeks after the accident, forwarded through 2 post offices, and delayed by the particular indifference of frontier mail. She had read it standing in the morning light outside the tent, Lily still asleep on the bedroll inside, and she had understood its meaning before she finished the first paragraph. "There is room here for you," he had written. "We have spoken it over, and Agnes agrees. You have worked long enough and hard enough, and this family should not let you face what is coming alone." She had folded the letter in half. "There is not, I am afraid, room enough for the child as well. We have our own grandchildren coming in the fall, and the house is already spoken for. And Agnes feels, and I agree with her, that it would be better for the little one to find a proper placement with a family who can give her what she needs." Clara had held the folded letter for a moment. Then she had walked to the small fire ring, where the coals from breakfast still glowed faintly, and she had placed the letter at the center of them, and she had watched it catch. She had not cried. She had not spoken. She had gone inside the tent to check that Lily was still sleeping, and then she had sat down on the flat rock near the creek and opened her notebook and written $14 at the top of a fresh page, and underneath it she had written the number 22, and then she had drawn a single line beneath the gap between them and sat looking at that line until its meaning was absolutely clear. The door to Iowa was closed. The door to Deadwood was worse than closed. The tent where she currently lived was shelter for summer and death by November. That was when she had begun walking the slopes above French Creek with the specific attention of someone looking for something, though she could not have named exactly what she was looking for until she found it. The cave was free. It was Joshua. It belonged to no one she could identify. That was enough to begin. On the second morning, she rose before Lily and climbed the slope with the thermometer before the sun had cleared the ridgeline. 59 inside, 63 outside. Not as dramatic a difference as the afternoon before, because the night had cooled the air significantly, but the relationship still held. The cave was still on the cooler side of ambient, still buffered, still maintaining something. She wrote the numbers down and climbed back to start breakfast. On the third morning, she did the same. 57 inside, 68 outside. The gap was widening as the summer day heated up. She wrote the numbers down. She continued for 7 days. She checked every morning at sunrise and every evening near sundown, 2 readings per day, 14 data points per week. She noted the air quality inside the cave. No persistent smell of sulfur or organic decay, which would have indicated drainage problems or animal habitation at a deeper level. She noted the floor's composition, solid limestone, with a thin layer of mineral dust that held no animal tracks larger than a small rodent. She noted the ceiling height sufficient for a woman of 5'4" to stand without bowing her head, and the depth approximately 30 feet from entrance to back wall. She measured the entrance width with her arms approximately 6 feet across, and noted the natural narrowing that occurred about 4 feet in where the rock pinched slightly before opening again into the main chamber. On the 6th day, she ran into Silas Brandt on the slope below the cave. He was a broad man somewhere near 60 himself, with a prospector's weathered patience and the particular directness of someone who had long ago decided that the frontier was no place for unnecessary words. He had a claim along the creek that he had been working since '78, and he knew this hillside the way men know land. They have crossed 1,000 times in all weathers. He stopped when he saw her coming down with the thermometer in her hand, and he looked from her to the cave entrance above and then back to her face, and his expression settled into the resigned skepticism of a man who has watched several plans fail in this territory. She told him briefly what she was measuring. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. Then he said what she expected him to say, which was that the cave would not hold heat in winter, that the stone would conduct cold rather than resist it, that a woman her age with a young child had no business attempting to winter in an unimproved limestone cavity in the Black Hills, and that he had seen younger and stronger people make worse miscalculations with worse outcomes. Clara waited until he finished. Then she held out the notebook with the 6 days of readings from him. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply held the numbers toward him and waited to see what a man would do with evidence he had not asked for. He looked at the notebook. He did not take it from her hand. She asked him if he had his own numbers to offer. He had no answer for that. He looked at the cave entrance once more, something shifting slightly in his expression. Not convinced, not open, but no longer entirely dismissive, and then he continued down the slope without speaking again. Clara watched him go, then turned and climbed back up. On the seventh day, she read the numbers and wrote them in the notebook beside the others, and then sat with all 14 data points arranged before her. The difference ranged between 9 and 14 degrees Fahrenheit, across the week, across variations in outside temperature, across a day of overcast sky, and a day of hard, direct sun. It did not vary based on weather. It did not vary based on time of day beyond the expected relationship between ambient temperature and the cave's buffering effect. The relationship was structural. The rock was doing something consistent, and consistent meant it could be planned around. She wrote the conclusion at the bottom of the page in the deliberate, slightly cramped handwriting she had developed, taking medical notes in poor light. She underlined it 3 times. The difference is structural, not circumstantial. It can be relied upon. The decision was made not with any dramatic feeling of resolution, but with the quiet finality of a diagnosis confirmed. She knew what she was working with now. Everything after this was logistics. Moving into the cave took the better part of 2 days. Most of what she owned was already minimal. The tent years had stripped her down to what could be carried by one woman and loaded onto Bess, the mule who had belonged to her son and had passed to her along with everything else after the accident. The tent canvas she took down, carefully folding it into sections that could serve as interior dividers and ground insulation. The iron stove was the problem. Harold's stove had been with her for 31 years. It was a small Franklin-style box stove in cast iron, roughly 18 inches on a side stubby leg, scarred across the top from decades of use and extremely heavy. It weighed somewhere near 80 pounds when empty, and she could not lift it alone. She had considered leaving it at the base of the slope and figured the logistics of getting it up later with Bess's help, and she had also more than once considered simply leaving it where it was and purchasing a lighter camp stove when finances allowed, which was to say never. The stove had been Harold's particular stubbornness. He had hauled it across 2 territorial moves in their marriage, had refused to sell it. When they were short on money, had made jokes about it, having better constitution than most people he knew. He had died 8 years ago in early spring, a fast pneumonia that had given them 4 days between the first cough and the last breath. And in that time, he had said many things and neglected to say many others. And afterward, Clara had developed the habit of keeping the stove near, as a kind of conversation that had no other medium. She was thinking about leaving it at the base of the slope when Lily walked over to it, wrapped both small arms around the nearest leg, pressed her cheek against the iron, and refused to move. The child had been quiet in the weeks since the accident, not silent. She laughed, sometimes asked questions about practical things, ate when food was offered. But the particular brightness that Clara remembered from the visits before, the quality of attention that her son had called Lily's searchlight, had dimmed. Watching her cling to that stove with her eyes closed and her face pressed against the cold metal, Clara felt something rearrange itself in her chest. She could not have said precisely what it meant, but she did not pull the child away. Instead, she spent 2 hours working out a rigging system with the rope and the mule, and by late afternoon the stove was in the cave, standing in the back left corner, where the ceiling was high enough to accommodate a stovepipe exit through a natural crack she packed with clay. The stovepipe was not perfect. It would need monitoring, but it would work. That night was the first night inside the cave. Clara arranged the bedding on the flat ground near the back wall, then lay down to test the surface. The stone's cold moved through the wool blanket and the thin canvas underneath with a patience that was almost methodical, a steady, reliable extraction of warmth from every point of contact along her back and hips and calves. It was not violent, it was not immediate. It was the kind of cold that would take 3 or 4 hours to work through a person in summer and considerably less time in January. She understood it in the first 10 minutes with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years understanding how bodies lose heat, how patients in shock cool from the outside in, how the floor was always the most dangerous surface in any underheated room. She sat up in the darkness. Lily was already asleep beside her, curled toward the warmth of the stove, which had been lit briefly to take the edge off the evening. Clara sat with her hand resting on the stone floor beside her, feeling its steady pull, and she thought about conduction and about the specific thermal dynamics of sleeping on the ground in winter. And then she said quietly to no one in particular, "No, not like that." In the morning, she began building the raised bed. She found the lumber from broken equipment crates along the creek bank wood that had been abandoned by mining operations and left to bleach in the sun. She carried it up the slope in loads of 2 or 3 pieces, stopping to rest more than she would have liked. The frame she built was simple four cross supports at 8-inch intervals laid across two long side rails. The whole thing raised 6 inches from the floor on stacked stone blocks at the corners. It was not elegant. It did not need to be elegant. It needed to break the contact between sleeping bodies and the stone floor. And it did that. Lily tested it immediately upon completion by climbing onto it, lying down with her arms at her sides and announcing that it was hard. Clara told her that hard was better than cold and that she would get used to it. The child considered this with the seriousness she brought to most statements, then rolled onto her side and appeared to accept the assessment. The following week was construction. Clara began the wall across the cave's entrance, selecting flat stones from the slope and the creek bed and carrying them up in the canvas sling she fashioned from a section of the tent. The wall she planned was not meant to be solid. A fully sealed entrance would strangle the air exchange and create the CO2 problem she had already identified through a brief and instructive experiment. She had lit a small fire one morning with the entrance blocked by the canvas and sat inside for 20 minutes before the headache began dull and pressurized behind her eyes the particular signature of insufficient oxygen. She had noted the time it took, calculated it against the volume of the cave and the oxygen consumption of 2 people in a fire, and arrived at the minimum ventilation requirement. 4 inches of gap in the upper corner of the wall on the windward side, small enough to be negligible in terms of heat loss, large enough to keep them breathing. The wall rose by a foot a day, sometimes less, when her back forced her to stop and sit on the slope and look at French Creek below until the pain eased. She did not allow herself to rest longer than the pain required. She had a calendar in her head. The frost patterns she had observed in the previous 2 winters told her that the first sustained cold would arrive sometime in early November, and she was working backward from that date with the discipline of someone preparing a patient for surgery. You list what needs to happen. You work the list. You do not add or subtract items based on how you feel that morning. Lily helped where a 4-year-old could help. She carried small stones in her apron pockets, solemnly depositing them at the base of the wall for Clara to place. She held the rope when Clara needed 2 attachment points. She slept predictably and ate what she was given, and asked questions that were sometimes practical, and sometimes the kind of lateral questions that young children ask, the ones that arrive at the edge of something true by a route that makes no obvious sense. One afternoon, watching Clara fit 2 stones together, she asked whether the wall would get lonely. Clara considered the question for a moment. Then she said that in her experience, walls did not get lonely because they had so much to do. The child seemed satisfied with this. In the evenings, Clara sat near the cave entrance with the notebook and worked through the math of winter. The core calculation was heat retention versus fuel consumption. She knew from the 7 days of baseline data that the cave maintained roughly a 12-degree advantage over outside air without any supplemental heat. In summer, this meant 58 degrees on a 70-degree day. In January, when outside temperatures in the Black Hills regularly fell to 0 or below 12 degrees of advantage, meant roughly 12 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing, and not adequate for a child or an older woman sleeping through the night. The stove changed the equation. The question was not how much wood to burn, but how to burn it to maximum thermal effect. Clara had observed something in the first week of camp cooking that she had filed away without fully analyzing at the time. The cave's stone walls held warmth after the fire died in a way that canvas and wood never did. She had noticed it as a comfort, at first, the way the air in the cave in the hour after a cooking fire felt gentler than it had any right to, as if the heat had been stored somewhere and was being returned in installments. Now she understood this as a quantifiable property and began to test it systematically. Each evening for 2 weeks, she lit a fire for a measured period, then extinguished it and tracked the temperature at 30-minute intervals through the night. The results were consistent enough to stake a conclusion on. 3 hours of fire in the iron stove brought the cave walls to a temperature that then radiated slowly for 6 to 7 hours after the fire was out, maintaining the interior at 8 to 12 degrees above what the unheated cave would otherwise hold. Pine burned hot and fast and loaded the stone with heat quickly. Oak burned slow and sustained and kept the release gradual. The correct sequence was pine first to charge the mass oak, second to extend the burn efficiently, fire out before midnight, and the stone did the rest. She wrote the protocol in the notebook with the same notational economy she had used for medication schedules. Pine first. Oak sustain, out by 3 hours. Stone holds remainder. She tested it for 5 nights in a row before she allowed herself to believe the numbers were reliable. On the last night of August, a storm came down from the north with no particular announcement. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. The wind came hard against the slope, and Clara lay on the raised bed listening to it press against the newly finished wall and find no purchase. Lily slept through the noise without stirring, her breathing slow, and even in the way of children who have not yet learned to be nervous about weather. Clara made a decision in the dark. She would not light the stove tonight. She would use this storm as a controlled experiment, and she would accept whatever the numbers told her in the morning without argument. She woke before sunrise and dressed without lighting the lantern, moving by the gray suggestion of light that came through the upper ventilation gap. She took the thermometer and read it carefully inside the cave, checking twice to be certain she had the angle right. Then she went outside into the aftermath of the storm, the slope still in shadow frost on the rocks, the creek below showing white at the edges. 43 degrees inside, 29 degrees outside, 14 degrees of difference. With no fire, after a night that had dropped to freezing and below. Clara stood outside in the cold for a moment with the thermometer in her hand and the notebook in the other. She looked at the cave entrance, at the wall she had built stone by stone, at the wooden door frame she had not yet hung. She looked at the number she had written. Then she went back inside and sat down on the edge of the raised bed and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She took the pen with the red ink. She had brought it for marking urgent entries the way she had once marked critical patient information in red, so it would not be missed in poor light. She had not used it yet. She used it now, writing the 2 numbers and then underneath them a single sentence. No fire. Storm night. 14 degrees held. She capped the pen and set it aside and sat with the open notebook on her knees. Lily stirred beside her, rolled over, blinked at the gray light. "Is it cold?" the child asked. Clara looked at the notebook. Then she looked at her granddaughter. "Not in here," she said. Lily accepted this, tucked herself back into the blankets, and returned to sleep. Clara sat with the numbers for a long time. The feeling that moved through her was not triumph, and it was not relief. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those. It was the feeling of a diagnosis confirmed, not the diagnosis you hoped for, not the one you feared, but the one that is accurate and that tells you exactly what you are working with and that allows the real work to begin. The cave was not a lucky accident. It was a system. And she understood it now. She understood what the 12 degrees meant. She understood what the stove could add to that baseline. She understood for the first time since she had unfolded the letter from her brother and walked it to the fire that the mathematics of survival had shifted from impossible to difficult, and that difficult was a territory she had spent her entire adult life navigating. The wall was nearly finished. The bed was built. The stove was in position. The firewood calculation was next, and it would need to be precise because once the snow came, the hillside would not yield more without significant effort, and significant effort in February at 63 was a quantity she could not count on with certainty. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write. September 1st. Wood needed calculate 90 days 3 hours per evening, burn mixed pine and oak at approximately 40 pounds per session. She paused, looked at the wall, looked at the door frame, waiting for its door, and added a line. Door must seal at the lower corner. No gaps. Recheck before first frost. Outside, French Creek moved below the slope, silver and ordinary. Inside the cave, the air set at 43 degrees without assistance, steady as a practiced pulse. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. 10 weeks to first hard frost. I have 10 weeks. She did not write that it would be enough. She did not write that she was afraid it would not be. She wrote the fact of the time available and the fact of the work remaining, and let those two things sit beside each other on the page the way patients sit beside diagnoses, without sentiment, without negotiation, waiting to see what action would follow from the understanding. It was the only way she knew to do it. It was, she had come to believe, over 63 years of doing it, the only way that worked. She spent the first week of September learning to split wood efficiently at 63. This was not something she had done regularly. Harold had split wood. Her son had split wood. The men around her had always split wood, while she did other things that needed doing, and now those men were gone, and the wood did not split itself, and there was nobody to ask. She stood at the chopping block she had made from a section of log near the creek, and she picked up the axe and she learned. The first hour was humbling in ways that had nothing to do with her pride, which she had largely set aside as a luxury item sometime in her mid-50s. The humiliation was purely physical. The axe pulled wrong. The angle was wrong. The wood skipped off the blade and tumbled into the dirt, and twice in the first 30 minutes she came close enough to her own foot that she stopped and stood back and reconsidered her grip and her stance with the deliberate attention she would have brought to any procedure she was doing incorrectly. She observed what was happening. She adjusted. She tried again. By the third day, she had found a rhythm that her body could sustain. Shorter strokes than she had initially attempted, the weight of the axe head doing more work than her arms, a slight pivot at the waist rather than a full swing. She was slower than a younger person would have been, and she needed to rest more often. And on the third evening, her palms had developed blisters that she treated with the same matter-of-fact attention she brought to any wound clean cover monitor. And the next morning, she wrapped them with cloth before picking up the axe again. Lily watched from a safe distance that Clara had designated clearly with a line scratched into the dirt. The child sat on a flat rock within that boundary and observed the process with her chin in her hands. On the fourth day, she asked if she could help, and Clara gave her the job of stacking the split wood against the cave wall as Clara carried it up, keeping the pine and oak separate. It was not a complicated task, but it required sustained attention and the maintenance of a system, and Lily performed it with a focus that made Clara think the child had more of her father in her than she had previously realized. Her son had been an ordered person. He had kept careful accounts and organized his tools by saying, remembered without being reminded that certain things needed doing at certain times. He had been a good man. Clara did not allow herself to think about this in detail while she was working. By mid-September, the woodpile along the cave's interior wall had grown to a shape that satisfied her preliminary calculations. She walked the length of it twice with the notebook, counting and estimating, converting the stack dimensions to chords by the rough formula she had worked out, and then she sat down and went through the math again. 90 days, 3 hours per night, 40 pounds per session on average, more in the coldest weeks, less in the mild ones, and she built a 15% buffers into her estimate because she had been a nurse long enough to know that projections in conditions you have not experienced tend toward optimism. The numbers were close. Not comfortable, but close. She would need to continue adding to the stack until October if she could manage it. Ruth Calloway appeared on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September, coming up the slope from the direction of the creek with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through before she reconsidered. Ruth was 52, a mine worker's wife, solid and brown from the sun, with a face that asked questions directly and waited for direct answers. She had been living near French Creek for 4 years, and she had nodded to Clara twice in passing, but they had not spoken at any length before the morning she appeared at the base of the cave's wall and looked up at the construction with an expression that was neither approving nor dismissive, but simply assessing. Clara came to the entrance and looked down at her. Ruth said she had been watching the wall go up for 2 weeks. She said her husband had told her it was a foolish waste of effort by a woman who did not understand winter in the Black Hills. She said she had decided to come and see for herself what exactly was being built and whether Thomas was right. Clara stepped back from the entrance and gestured for Ruth to come inside. Ruth entered the cave and stood for a moment without speaking. Clara watched her take in the stove in the corner, the raised bed, the firewood stacked along the wall in 2 separate sections with a gap between them, the lantern on the stone shelf that Clara had chipped out near the entrance, the notebook on the bed where she had left it open to the current page of temperature readings. Ruth walked to the notebook. She picked it up without asking, which Clara found she did not mind. She turned the pages, slowly reading the numbers, and Clara watched her eyes move across the columns, the way eyes move when they are actually processing rather than performing the act of looking. Ruth was quiet for long enough that Lily, sitting near the stove, with a piece of chalk and a flat rock she was using as a drawing surface, looked up to check that the visitor was still there. When Ruth spoke, she said that she had not known stone held heat like that. She said she thought the numbers were telling her something she had not previously understood about how this kind of shelter worked. Clara said yes, that was what the numbers were doing. Ruth set the notebook down carefully, exactly where she had found it. Then she looked at Clara with the straightforward appraisal of one practical woman looking at another and said she needed to learn how to read those numbers properly. What developed over the following weeks was an exchange that had the clean logic of barter. Ruth brought preserved food from her own stores, pemmican and dried beans, and a jar of rendered fat in quantities that supplemented what Clara had without making a significant dent in what Ruth could spare. In exchange, Clara answered medical questions that had apparently been accumulating for years, questions about the wound on Thomas Calloway's forearm that had not healed as it should, about the cough Ruth's husband had developed the previous winter, about what to do when a person's temperature ran high without obvious cause. Clara answered each question with the precision of someone who understood that imprecise medical information in a place without doctors was not just unhelpful, but actively dangerous. It was during one of these exchanges that she noticed Ruth's particular way of describing her husband's injuries. The forearm wound, a cut to the hand 2 weeks prior, a bruised rib from a falling timber the month before that. Not complaining, just reporting with the slightly compressed quality of someone who has learned to present concerning information without attaching alarm to it. Clara filed the information with the same system she filed all clinical observations noted, categorized, flagged for monitoring. The wall was finished by the last week of September. Clara stood back and looked at it with Lily beside her, the child's hand in hers, both of them examining the construction with the same slightly cocked attention. The wall was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. The stones fitted together with varying degrees of precision, tighter at the lower courses, where she had learned the technique, and looser in the early upper sections before she learned it again. The wooden door frame was set into the central opening at a width of 22 inches, which was enough to enter sideways while carrying wood. The 4-inch gap at the upper right corner was exactly as she had planned it, a small imperfection that was in fact a precise, deliberate choice, a distinction that pleased her more than she admitted to anyone. She was hanging the door, a plank construction she had assembled from the last of the crate wood, heavy enough to seal well and hinged with leather straps, when she discovered the problem. The lower left corner did not seat against the frame. There was a gap of approximately 3/4 of an inch running the full height of the lower left quarter of the door, a consequence of a slight warp in the wood and a slight irregularity in the frame that had been invisible until the door was hung and closed and she had looked at it from the inside. She looked at the gap for a long time. She thought about what 3/4 of an inch meant at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with the wind at velocity against the exposed face of the slope. She ran the numbers in her head the way she ran medication calculations, and not hoping for a different answer, just wanting to be sure of the one she had. The gap would bleed heat, not catastrophically, not immediately, but across a night, across a week of nights, across January, it would accumulate into a deficit that her fuel budget could not absorb without risk. She took the door down. She set it against the wall and looked at it. Then she looked at her hands, which were raw from the cold that had begun to settle into the mornings. The skin cracked at the knuckles where the blisters had healed and the new skin had not yet toughened to the work. She picked up the tools and began again. It took 4 days to recut the frame edge and adjust the door's lower rail and rehang everything in the correct alignment. On the 4th evening, she closed the door and ran her hand along every edge and found no gap she could feel or see in the lantern light. She opened it and closed it twice more, and both times it seated cleanly. Lily had watched the entire process of taking the door down with a solemnity that had shifted as the afternoon went on into something that looked like distress. On the 3rd day, the child had started to cry quietly. Not dramatically, just a steady welling of tears that she did not entirely seem to understand herself. Clara had set down the tools and crouched to the child's level. She did not tell her not to cry. She looked at the small face and the cracked and reddened hands of her own, and she said, "When something is not right, you take it apart and you do it again, even when it hurts to do it. That is not failure. That is just how good work gets made." Lily had looked at her grandmother's hands for a long time after that. Then she had wiped her face and picked up a small stone from the floor and held it out, a contribution to the reconstruction, though the stone was too small to be useful. Clara took it anyway and set it on the frame with great care, and that was the end of the crying. October came cold and early. The mornings required a fire now, brief ones, just enough to take the edge off while they ate. Clara began the formal testing of the heating protocol she had designed. Each evening, she lit the stove, at the same hour added pine in the sequence she had determined transition to oak at the 30-minute mark, and extinguished the fire at exactly 3 hours. Each morning, she read the thermometer at first light before any heat from the coming day could affect the reading, and she wrote the number down. The data was consistent. Every morning for 2 weeks, the cave held between 8 and 12 degrees above what the unheated outside temperature registered. The range was within her projections. The protocol worked. She added a column to the notebook: wood consumed per session, estimated in pounds by the feel and density of each piece, cross-referenced against the following morning's temperature reading. By mid-October, she had enough data to refine her fuel budget, and the revised calculation was within 3% of her original estimate. She noted this without celebration. It was simply accurate, and accurate was what was required. Silas Brandt came by on a Wednesday afternoon while she was stacking the last load of wood she would bring in before the first hard freeze made the slope difficult. He stood below the wall and looked at the construction in its complete form: the fitted stones, the door seated in its frame, the pipe exiting neatly through the upper rock, the two separated wood piles visible through the open entrance. He stood there long enough that she noticed him and came to the entrance. He looked at the wood pile. He said what she expected him to say, which was that it still did not look like enough. Clara said it was enough for the system she was using. She said it the way she would have told a patient the correct dosage after the patient had suggested she ought to increase it. Not unkindly, just with the finality of someone who had done the calculation. Silas looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted slightly, not into agreement, but into a different quality of attention. He looked at the two separate wood piles with their pine and oak divided at the notebook she was holding at the door in its frame. He looked at these things the way he had not looked at them the first 2 times he had passed, with a kind of reluctant curiosity that wanted to understand the logic even if it had not decided to endorse it. He did not say anything more. He went down the slope, but this time he did not look back. The last evening of October, Clara stood at the cave entrance while Lily slept behind her. The world below was silvered with the first frost that had held through sunrise. French Creek was slower than it had been a week ago. The water thickened at its edges. The sky above the ridgeline was clear and very dark and full of stars in the specific abundance of high-altitude autumn, the kind of sky that reminded you that you were small and that the season did not hold any particular opinion about whether you made it through. She opened the notebook. Lily, 4 years old, myself, 63, 10 weeks behind us, winter ahead, wood sufficient by calculation with buffer, door sealed, ventilation confirmed adequate, stove positioned, protocol tested and verified. What I cannot calculate, the variables I have not yet encountered. What I can do, maintain the system until I encounter them and adjust when I do. She closed the notebook. Behind her, the iron stove sat in its corner, cooling after the evening fire, still radiating its careful stored heat into the limestone around it. 31 years of Harold's stubbornness, sitting in the back of a cave in the Black Hills, doing exactly what it was designed to do. She had thought about him more in the past 10 weeks than she had in the 3 years before them. Not the grief of missing him, which she had made her separate accommodation with long ago, but the specific texture of his judgment, his insistence on the things that weighed the most, his refusal to leave behind what other people called unnecessary, his habit of making decisions that did not make sense until you were standing in the situation where they did. She had never told him he was right about the stove. She had not had the opportunity, and she was not certain she would have taken it if she had. But standing at the entrance to a limestone cave in the early dark of November's approach, with a child sleeping on a raised bed behind her, and 14 degrees of thermal buffer between them, and whatever was coming, she thought, "You were right, Harold. You were right about the stove, and I wish you were here to know it." 10 weeks. She had spent them the only way she knew how. Now the winter would tell her whether it was enough. November arrived the way serious things arrive, without announcement, without the courtesy of transition. One morning, the world outside the cave entrance was the same frost-edged autumn it had been for 3 weeks, and the next morning, it was something categorically different. The temperature had dropped through the night with the focused intention of a season that had been patient long enough, and when Clara pushed open the door at first light and stepped onto the slope, the air entered her lungs with the particular authority of cold that means business. Not discomfort, not inconvenience. the kind of cold that kills slowly and without apology if you let it. She had the thermometer in her hand before the door was fully open. She read the outside number first, standing in the pre-dawn gray with her breath making small, urgent clouds. Then she stepped back inside, closed the door, and waited 60 seconds before reading the inside number. She wrote both in the notebook without sitting down: 41 inside, 3 line outside. 38 degrees of separation. The protocol had run the previous evening exactly as designed. Pine First Oak sustained fire out before midnight, and the cave had absorbed what it needed and held it through the coldest night of the season so far. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Lily slept with one arm flung out to the side, her breathing slow, and even her face turned toward the stove in the unconscious way that sleeping creatures orient toward warmth. The iron box had stopped ticking an hour or two ago when the last heat contracted into stillness, but the air in the cave retained the quality of somewhere recently warmed. Not warm itself, but not hostile, either the way a room holds the presence of people who have just left it. Clara opened the notebook to the protocol page and read through it once, not because she had forgotten it, but because precision deserved the respect of repetition. Pine first, oak sustain, 3 hours, and out by midnight. Stone holds the remainder. She had done this for 12 consecutive nights. The data was consistent to within 2 degrees every morning. She understood now with the certainty that comes only from repeated observation, rather than theory, that the system was not fragile. It had tolerances. It had a margin. This was perhaps the most important thing she had learned in 63 years of work in systems both human and otherwise. The difference between a plan that breaks under pressure and one that bends and holds is whether it was built with a margin or built to a single point of perfection that real conditions will always violate. She opened the firebox door to check the ash bed because the morning work did not wait. The wall continued performing. She had packed the interior face of the lower courses with a clay and grass mixture she had prepared in October, and it had dried into a firm insulating layer that reduced the cold seep at ground level significantly. She checked it once a week, running her hand along the base, feeling for the damp patches that would indicate frost penetration from outside. Through the first 2 weeks of November, she found nothing concerning. The seam between wall and floor held. Ruth came on a Tuesday morning with a cloth bag that clinked slightly when she set it on the cave floor. Inside were 4 small jars of preserved food, 2 of pickled beets, 1 of salted pork fat, 1 of dried apple slices, and a question about whether Clara had any experience with a fever that came and went without obvious infection source. Clara had a great deal of experience with exactly that. She asked the relevant questions and listened to the answers and gave her assessment with the directness that the situation required, then watched Ruth absorb it with the particular quality of attention that told her Ruth was not a person who received medical information passively. She asked a follow-up question that was more precise than the first. Clara revised her explanation accordingly. This was the rhythm of their exchange through November. Ruth arrived with food and questions. Clara answered the questions with the full weight of her training and gave Ruth the medical logic behind each answer, rather than just the conclusion, because a person in Ruth's situation needed to understand the mechanism, not just the prescription. Ruth, for her part, never arrived empty-handed and never overstayed, and she had the rare quality of being able to sit in silence without filling it with noise. Clara found this quality deeply restful after 63 years of people who confuse quiet with neglect. On one of these visits, Ruth mentioned that her husband had re-injured the forearm wound while working in the mine 2 days prior. She said it without emphasis, the way she described most things involving Thomas, with a slight compression in the telling that Clara had come to recognize as the way Ruth managed the distance between what was happening and what she allowed herself to feel about it. Clara asked how he had re-injured it. Ruth described the mechanism, a tool slipping against the healing tissue under pressure. Clara asked whether the wound was draining. Ruth said a little clear-colored. Clara asked the color of the skin around it. Ruth gave the answer, then paused and asked why the color mattered. Clara told her why the color mattered. Ruth listened with the look of someone who would not forget what they were being told. Clara noted Thomas Calloway's accumulating injuries in the back of the notebook. In the margin column, she had reserved for observations that did not fit the primary categories. The forearm, the hand cut, the rib. Now the forearm again. Not a pattern that required action yet, but a pattern that required watching. The temperature data through mid-November showed the outside dropping in stages 3 degrees, 1 week, 5 the next, then a brief moderation that lasted 4 days before dropping again to a new low. The cave tracked each drop with its reliable lag, absorbing the change and presenting it to the morning thermometer as something smaller and more manageable than the raw exterior number. Clara continued refining the firewood consumption estimates based on the actual data accumulating in the notebook. The calculation was holding. She was running approximately 4% ahead of estimated consumption, meaning she had burned slightly more than projected in the first 3 weeks. Not alarming, potentially the result of the early cold snap being sharper than her baseline estimates had accounted for. She adjusted the margin downward slightly and flagged the trend for monitoring. On a Thursday morning in the third week of November, Lily climbed down from the bed before Clara was fully awake and sat herself at the foot of it with the notebook open across her knees and the short pencil in her hand. Clara watched through half-open eyes. The child was looking at the thermometer mounted on the cave wall, then looking at the notebook, then making marks with a concentration so total she had not noticed Clara watching. The marks were not numbers in any recognizable form. They were a child's approximation of number shapes, earnest and slightly irregular, but arranged in the correct column on the page with an instinctive grasp of the format she had been watching Clara use for 4 months. Clara lay still and let her finish. When Lily looked up and found her grandmother watching, she held the notebook out with an expression that was equal parts pride and the specific anxiety of someone who is not sure whether they have done something right or ruined something important. Clara took the notebook. She looked at the marks. The temperature Lily had recorded, interpreted from the shapes, was close to accurate, within 1 degree of what Clara read when she checked it herself. She looked at the small face watching her. She said, "That is correct." The second number is a little low, but you had the right idea. Then she gave the notebook back and told Lily to record the corrected number beside her own, and the child bent back over the page with renewed gravity. This became a morning ritual from that day forward. Lily recorded first. Clara checked and corrected if necessary. The child's accuracy improved across the following 2 weeks to the point where she was reading the thermometer independently and correctly most mornings, her small face pressed close to the glass with total absorption. Clara said nothing about how this made her feel. She simply maintained the ritual with the same consistency she maintained the firing protocol, because consistency was what rituals required to hold their meaning. The first real test of the complete system came at the beginning of December. A cold front moved in from the northwest on a Sunday night, the kind that Clara could feel in her joints before the thermometer confirmed it, a specific aching pressure in her right knee and both wrists that she had learned over the past decade to treat as a reliable meteorological instrument. She ran the protocol that evening with a slight modification. She added 1 extra piece of oak at the 2-hour mark, making the burn run hotter and longer before she extinguished it. Her reasoning was that if the outside temperature was going to drop further than recent nights, the thermal buffer she was trying to maintain needed a larger initial charge. In the morning, the outside read -8, inside 40 degrees, a 32-degree separation, larger than the standard overnight, the extra charge from the extended burn, visible in the numbers. She wrote the modified protocol in the notebook with the notation extended, burn 1 additional oak, and the resulting temperature differential. It was a data point. It told her the system had an adjustable range that she had not previously quantified. She filed it the way she filed everything useful. Lily read the outside number that morning and stopped moving for a moment. She looked up from the thermometer at Clara, and in her face was the particular expression of a child encountering a large fact for the first time, not fear exactly, but the preliminary recognition of something that needed to be understood. Clara looked at the number with her. She said, "The cave is 40 degrees. Outside is -8. She paused. "Do you understand what that means?" Lily thought about it. Then she said that it meant the cave was different from outside. Clara said yes, exactly that. December moved in its relentless way, it accumulating cold the way a debt accumulates when you are not looking at it. The nights became longer than the days in a manner that felt intentional rather than astronomical, as if darkness were asserting a principle. The creek below was audible now only where the current ran fastest at the center channel. The edges had frozen weeks ago, and the ice crept inward daily. Clara could see it from the cave entrance on the clear mornings when she stepped out to take the reading. the white advancing toward the dark water, the world incrementally sealing itself. She was splitting wood on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of December when her shoulder told her it was finished for the day. Not the gradual warning it usually gave, a mounting discomfort that she could work through for another hour, but the sudden and absolute refusal of a joint that had simply reached its limit. She set the axe down. She sat on the chopping block. She stayed there for a few minutes, her hand on her shoulder, assessing the nature of the problem with the same clinical detachment she would have applied to a patient's complaint, which is to say without panic but without denial either. It was not a tear. The pain pattern was wrong for structural damage, too diffuse, too symmetric in its distribution across the joint. It was fatigue, deep muscle fatigue, the kind that required rest rather than management. She had pushed the wood-splitting sessions harder in the past 2 weeks, aware that the window for adding to the stockpile before sustained deep snow was narrowing. She had not accounted sufficiently for what 63-year-old shoulders could sustain across an extended period of repetitive heavy work. She made two decisions in that moment. First, she would rest the shoulder for 3 days, which meant accepting the tighter margin as the operating parameter rather than a problem to solve by force. Second, she would adjust the protocol starting that night fractionally smaller, burns the difference measured in single logs designed to extend the fuel supply without compromising the thermal floor below, which the cave would become dangerous for Lily. She was recording this calculation in the notebook when Jeremiah Cole knocked on the door in the middle of the night. It was 11 days into December, well past midnight, and the knock was not the decisive sound of someone who had considered the act before committing to it. It was the knock of a hand that had lost some of its coordination, 3 impacts irregular in force with a pause between the second and third that told her the person on the other side of the door was not at full capacity. She was on her feet before she had finished identifying all of this, moving to the door with the instinct of someone who has been woken by sounds requiring medical response too many times to count. She opened it. The man standing outside was in his mid-40s, big-framed, in the way of men who do heavy physical labor as a matter of course, and he was shaking with the uncontrolled quality of muscle response that she recognized before she had even processed his face. His lips had a bluish cast visible even in the low lantern light. His skin had the particular pale gray tone of someone whose peripheral circulation had been redirecting blood to the core for several hours. He was looking at her with an expression that was trying to be coherent and mostly failing. She said his name. She knew him by sight from the creek and had noted his chimney smoke from the direction of his cabin all autumn. And he managed to say that the flue had blocked, that the fire had died, that he had woken cold and not thought clearly, and that he had walked 2 miles in negative 15-degree air in the clothes he had been sleeping in because the cold had gotten into his thinking before he understood what was happening. She stepped back and let him in. She did not think about it as a choice. It was a clinical situation with a clear protocol, a person presenting with moderate hypothermia, approximately 2 to 3 hours of core temperature loss, no visible injury, responsive and ambulatory. She put him close to the stove, not touching it, not immediately adjacent, because rapid rewarming of extremities and hypothermia can drive cold blood back to the core and cause cardiac events, which is information most people do not have, and which makes the difference between helping and killing someone with kindness. She gave him water that she warmed slowly over the reopened stove, small amounts at frequent intervals. She kept him awake and talking, asking him questions about the cabin and the flue and the walkover, not because she needed the information, but because sustained verbal response was a reliable indicator of cognitive recovery. She did not let him sleep for 90 minutes. He pushed back on this. His eyes were heavy, and he wanted badly to close them, and he said so with increasing insistence as the shaking gradually subsided and the warmth began to restore itself through his tissues. Clara told him that he would sleep when she said he could sleep, and the tone she used was the same tone she had used on patients who wanted to get up too soon, and on men who argued with her medical assessments, and on anyone who confused her quiet manner with an absence of conviction. He stopped pushing back. By 2 in the morning, he was shaking only intermittently. By 3, he was coherent enough to answer questions about his medical history, which she asked because she needed to know whether there were underlying factors that might complicate his recovery. There were none of significance. By 4, she let him sleep folded into a sitting position against the cave wall, near the stove with a blanket around his shoulders, and Lily, entirely unimpressed by the intrusion, curled in the raised bed on the other side of the cave. Clara did not sleep again that night. She monitored Jeremiah Cole's breathing and color at 30-minute intervals, noted the progressive improvement in his skin tone as circulation normalized, and sat with her notebook working through the fuel implications of running the stove reopened and at higher output for an additional 3 hours beyond the protocol schedule. The math was manageable. The margin was thinner. She adjusted the projection forward and noted the new parameters. In the morning, Jeremiah woke with the disoriented quality of someone who had lost the thread of the night, and Clara watched him reconstruct it: the blocked flue, the failing fire, the walk the door, and now this cave that was warm in a way his cabin had never been warm. He sat with Void, his hands around a cup of heated water, and looked at the stovepipe in the ceiling, and at the thermometer on the wall, and at the notebook on the bed, and then he looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has found themselves in the middle of a logic they did not know existed. His chest shifted as the question formed, "You have had this figured out since when?" Clara considered the precise answer. "Since August," she told him. "The data collection started in July." He looked at the two wood piles, the pine and oak separated with a gap between them. He looked at the ventilation gap in the upper corner of the wall. She realized, a man who understood constructed systems, who could read the design logic of a thing that had been deliberately made rather than accidentally assembled. He turned back to face her, and something in his expression had reorganized itself into a different configuration than the night before. He said, "You figured all of this out alone." When Clara set down her own cup, she said, "I had the numbers. The numbers were not complicated once I had enough of them." He left at mid-morning after confirming the flue issue was one he could fix with a simple mechanical clearance, which she told him to do before lighting the stove again. He went down the slope with the careful movement of a man who was not yet fully confident in his legs, and who knew it. And at the base of the slope, he stopped and looked back up at the cave entrance, at the wall, and the door in the pipe, and then he continued toward his cabin. The second week of December brought a development in the woodpile that Clara had been tracking for 10 days without quite articulating to herself. The consumption rate had crept above her adjusted projections by a consistent 2 logs per week, not from any single large deviation, but from a dozen small ones that had accumulated. The shoulder had slowed her ability to add to the pile. The unplanned burn for Jeremiah had made a contribution. The slightly sharper cold of the first weeks of December had pushed the nightly burn closer to the upper end of the protocol range. None of these individually was significant. Together, they had eaten into the margin in a way that required acknowledgement. She sat with the numbers on a Thursday evening after Lily was asleep and worked through 3 scenarios. In the first winter followed the pattern of the previous 2 years, with February moderating by the 3rd week. In this scenario, fuel was adequate with the current adjusted protocol. In the second winter ran cold through the end of February, as she had been told it could do in bad years. In this scenario, fuel was marginal survivable, but requiring further reductions in the nightly burn that would push the interior temperature closer to the thermal floor she was comfortable with for Lily. In the third scenario, she added a significant cold event, the kind of multi-day temperature drop that Silas Brandt had described in passing as the thing that separated ordinary winters from the ones people still talked about 20 years later. In this scenario, fuel became the constraint that everything else bent around. She did not catastrophize. She did not minimize. She wrote all 3 scenarios in the notebook with their implications and their response protocols, and then she made one immediate adjustment, 1 less log per nightly burn beginning tonight. The interior temperature would run slightly cooler as a result. She compensated by having Lily sleep in 2 wool layers instead of 1, and by repositioning the bed fractionally closer to the stove. The child did not notice the adjustment and did not complain. Ruth came on a Saturday in the 3rd week of December, and the report she brought about Thomas's forearm was one that Clara had been expecting in some form, though the specific detail was worse than she had projected. The wound had opened again at a point that had appeared healed 2 weeks prior, and the drainage had changed color, no longer clear, but slightly cloudy, in a way that Ruth described with the precision of someone who had been told to pay attention to exactly this. Clara asked the questions she needed to ask. She confirmed what she suspected. The infection was not severe, not yet, but it was present, and it was in a location that had implications for the function of the hand if it progressed. She gave Ruth a treatment protocol. cleaning, packing, monitoring temperature, both of the wound and of Thomas himself, and she gave it with the same directness she used for everything, which included telling Ruth that if the wound temperature increased or the drainage darkened further, the situation would have moved beyond what either of them could manage without a physician, and that Deadwood was the nearest option, and that Ruth needed to make that calculation before it became urgent rather than after. Ruth listened. She asked two questions, both specific and intelligent. Then she folded the information into herself in the way she folded everything without visible drama and asked whether Clara needed anything this week. Clara thought about the woodpile. She thought about the shoulder. She said she could use help carrying down 2 loads from the deadfall she had identified on the northern face of the slope 3 weeks ago if Thomas was well enough to be left for a few hours. Ruth came back the following Tuesday with her neighbor's older son, a 16-year-old named Aaron, who was solidly built and asked no questions about why an older woman needed wood carried to a cave in December, and together the three of them brought down enough deadfall to restore the margin to something that felt like a working buffer. Clara's shoulder was grateful in the particular way that a joint is grateful when it is not asked to do the thing that was hurting it. She noted the restored fuel quantity in the notebook and recalculated against the 3 scenarios. The first and second scenarios were now adequately covered. The third, the severe event, remained tight. January arrived with a formality that felt almost administrative, as if the season had reviewed its options and decided to get serious. The temperature dropped in the first week and stayed down in a way that was qualitatively different from December's drops, which had been sharp but mobile, moving up and down across the zero line with some flexibility. January settled below zero and seemed to forget that other temperatures existed. The creek was fully frozen except at the absolute center, and even that was moving sluggishly audible, only when the wind dropped completely, a small dark thread of cold water persisting beneath its own momentum. Clara modified the protocol again for the January conditions. The extended burn she had tested in November, 1 additional oak log at the 2-hour mark, became standard procedure rather than exceptional. She tracked fuel consumption daily now rather than weekly, the shorter accounting interval appropriate to the smaller margin available. Each morning's temperature reading was entered in the notebook with the previous night's burn notation, building a data record that now stretched across 5 months and contained more information about this particular cave's thermal behavior than had ever existed before or would likely exist again. Ruth brought news when she came in mid-January that 2 men had abandoned their claims and left the area in the first week of the month, citing the cold and the poor prospects. She reported this without particular emotion, the way you report weather. She also reported that the families in 2 cabins downstream were managing but struggling, that one had run low on firewood and was supplementing with green wood that burned inefficiently and left them with a smoke problem as well as a heat problem. Clara listened and considered the picture Ruth was drawing. The cold was not affecting everyone equally. The people who had prepared more carefully were holding. The people who had prepared adequately were straining. The people who had not prepared at all were leaving or suffering the consequences of staying. She thought about this on the nights when she sat with the notebook after Lily slept, not with any self-congratulatory feeling, but with the analytical interest of someone who was observing a system at scale and comparing the outcomes to the inputs. The cave was not magic. The system was not mysterious. What it required was the same thing every reliable system required: correct design, consistent operation, and the discipline not to deviate from either when the conditions became uncomfortable. She had seen nursing colleagues over the years who abandoned protocol under pressure because the pressure made the protocol feel inadequate, who reached for something bigger and more dramatic because consistency seemed too small an answer to a large problem. They were almost always wrong. The dramatic intervention, the deviation from the reliable procedure, was almost always where things went sideways. She wrote this down in the notebook, not as a conclusion, but as an observation. Pressure is when the protocol matters most, not least. On a Thursday evening in the last week of January, Silas Brandt knocked on the cave door. It was not the urgent, disoriented knock of someone in crisis. It was 3 deliberate, evenly spaced impacts. The knock of a man who had thought about knocking before he did it, who had stood outside in the cold and made a considered decision and then executed it without ambiguity. Clara opened the door. He stood in the lamplight from inside the cave, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has been wrong about something specific and knows it, and has decided to do something about that knowledge rather than simply carry it. He said that his cabin had run out of firewood 2 days ago. He said it the way Ruth described Thomas's injuries factually, without the protective coloring of excuse or self-pity. He was burning furniture. He had another few days before that ran out. He said, "I am not asking you to save me. I am asking you to tell me how you did what you did." Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 2 times he had told her she would fail, about the way he had looked at the notebook she held out to him on the slope in July and not taken it from her hand. She did not feel the pleasure of being right. She had never particularly valued that pleasure. She stepped back from the door and told him to come inside. He sat down on the stone near the wall, not in the space that was theirs, instinctively understanding the cave's social geography, and she handed him the notebook open to the first page of July data. He read slowly, turning pages, going back occasionally to cross-reference 2 entries. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. Lily woke briefly, regarded him with the assessment of a child cataloging a new face, and went back to sleep. When Silas finally set the notebook down on his knee and looked up, his expression was not the chastened look of a man accepting he had been wrong. It was the alert, forward-looking expression of someone who has encountered a new piece of information and is already working out its implications. He asked her one question. The temperature never dropped below 38 even without the fire. Clara said correct. She said it was the limestone mass and the structural orientation, and then she said she did not have a complete explanation for the floor of 38 degrees, only the consistent observation of it across 5 months. He looked at the back wall for a moment. His eyes moved to the particular layering of the rock face, and something in his face changed in the way that faces change when a piece of knowledge connects with a piece of observation to produce something new. He said he would tell her the rest of it tomorrow if she would let him come back. He said he thought he understood why the floor held. Clara said he could come back. He left, going down the dark slope with a steadier stride than she expected from a man who had been burning furniture to stay warm. She stood at the door for a moment, watching him go, feeling the cold air against her face, and thinking about what he had said. She did not know what he knew about the geology of this hillside. She knew that whatever it was, it would tell her something the numbers had been pointing toward without fully explaining, and the prospect of a complete answer for the system she had been living inside for 5 months produced in her the clean, specific anticipation of someone who prefers understanding to mystery. She took the red pen from the notebook's back pocket and uncapped it ready. Then she decided to wait. Some data was worth waiting for. She recapped the pen, turned the lamp down, and lay down beside Lily in the dark cave that was 38 degrees at its coldest, and had kept them both alive through everything the season had thrown at it so far. Outside, the temperature was falling again. The stone held. Silas came back the next morning as he had said he would, arriving at the cave door in the gray early light with the purposeful timing of a man who means what he says. Clara had the stove going and the notebook open on the bed beside her. Lily was still asleep. The outside temperature was -11, and Silas's face carried the particular tightness of skin that has been exposed to serious cold for the walk over. But he was moving well and his eyes were clear, which told her the furniture burning had bought him enough time. He came inside and did not take off his coat. He went directly to the back wall of the cave and ran his hand along the rock in a specific way, not the exploratory touch of someone feeling for texture, but the practiced pressure of someone checking for something they already know how to find. He moved along the wall slowly, about 4 feet up from the floor, pressing at intervals with the heel of his palm. Near the left rear corner, he stopped. He told her to come and put her hand where his was. She did. The stone there was different. Not in temperature exactly, though there was a marginal warmth to it that she had registered before and attributed to the stove's proximity. It was in the quality of the surface, the faintest suggestion of moisture beneath the mineral. Not wet, not damp in any problematic way, but present. The stone was alive with something moving inside it. Silas said, "There is a water seam behind this wall, running water underground, maybe 8 to 12 feet back through the rock. Water at that depth in this formation does not freeze and does not drop below 45 degrees. It has been heating this wall from behind since before either of us was born. Clara kept her hand on the wall. She stood very still. He went on explaining it the way a man explains something he learned over years of work underground, not performing the knowledge but delivering it. The limestone formation on this slope sat above a subsurface drainage network that ran from the higher elevations down toward the creek. The water in that network was insulated by depth and rock mass from surface temperature variation, maintaining a consistent temperature year-round that was determined by the Earth's own internal warmth rather than by the season above it. The cave's wall was essentially a radiator. It had been putting heat into this space since the hill was formed. Clara took her hand from the wall and looked at the 5 months of data in the notebook that she had been reading as evidence of a structural system without understanding the engine underneath the structure. The numbers had told her something true. They had just not told her the whole truth. The whole truth was larger and older and more reliable than anything she could have designed. She took the red pen from the notebook's back pocket. She opened to the current page. She wrote water seam confirmed rear left wall, consistent minimum independent of season. Confirmed S. Brandt, February 1884. She looked at what she had written for a moment, then drew a clean line under it. Every reading she had taken since July, every morning, she had pressed the thermometer against the still air of the cave and recorded the number without knowing why the floor held where it held. All of it had been true. The data had been reliable. She simply had not known what it was measuring. Now she did. This was she understood how knowledge worked when you did not have the luxury of being taught. You observed, you recorded, you operated on what the numbers told you was reliable even without understanding the mechanism. And eventually, if you stayed in contact with the problem long enough and remained open to what other people's different knowledge could add, the mechanism revealed itself. The cave had not become more trustworthy in the moment Silas identified the water seam. It had been exactly as trustworthy all along. What had changed was her ability to explain it, which was a different and smaller thing than the trustworthiness itself. She told Silas he could stay the day and she would show him the complete protocol. He did not express gratitude in any explicit way, which she found she respected. He simply nodded and sat down on the stone near the wall and waited for her to begin. She walked him through the notebook from the first page, explaining each column and what it measured and why, describing the derivation of the protocol through the testing phase in September and October, the modifications she had made in response to specific conditions, the fuel calculation, and its current status. He asked questions that were mostly precise and technical, the questions of someone who understood constructed systems and wanted to understand this one from the inside. When she got to the ventilation calculation, the 4-inch gap, and the reasoning behind it, he stopped her and asked her to explain the CO2 reasoning in detail, and she did. And he said nothing for a moment, and then said that he had not known that he had always simply left a gap in his cabin wall and had not known it was necessary rather than just a failure of construction. Clara said that most of the things people do correctly, they do for the wrong reasons, and that doing them for the right reasons only mattered when conditions changed and you needed to know which parts of what you were doing were load-bearing. Silas looked at her with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. 2 days after that, in the first week of February, the temperature dropped in a way that was different from everything that had come before it. The previous cold had been a presence, assertive and sustained. This was something else in absence, the removal of something fundamental from the air, until what remained was a quality that the word cold did not quite describe. -24 the first morning, -29 the second. On the third morning, Clara opened the door, a careful 6 inches, read the thermometer she had mounted just outside the entrance, and the number was -34. She closed the door. She stood with the inside thermometer in her hand and looked at the number 40 degrees. The seam between outside and inside was now 74 degrees of separation. The cave was holding not just its baseline, but the accumulated charge of 3 nights of careful burning, the stone's mass working as the thermal battery she had understood it to be since September, releasing heat at the slow, steady rate that made it survivable rather than merely warmer. But this was the morning Jeremiah arrived before she had finished the first reading. His knock was controlled, deliberate, not the disoriented 3-impact knock of his first arrival, but the purposeful double knock of a man who has made a plan and is executing it. She opened the door, and he was standing in full winter gear with a load of firewood in his arms, pine split, and dried the good kind. He told her that his cabin's roof had taken damage in the night, not structural failure, but a section of the shake roofing that had cracked under ice load and was admitting cold air at a rate that his stove could not compensate for. He had a neighbor's place he could stay at if the neighbor would have him, but first he had brought wood because he had figured she would be running protocol modifications tonight, and he wanted to contribute to the fuel situation. She stepped back from the door. He came in and stacked the wood in the pine section with the natural organization of someone who had spent enough time looking at her system to understand its logic. Lily woke at the sound and sat up on the bed and looked at Jeremiah with the resigned acceptance of a child who has added a visitor to her morning catalog. Before Jeremiah had finished stacking, Ruth was at the door. Clara heard the knock and moved to open it, and Ruth came in fast, the cold coming in with her in a brief, sharp wave before Clara pushed the door closed again. Ruth's face was carrying something tightly controlled, the expression Clara associated with the medical situations that had escalated beyond the managed category. She said that Thomas had tried to get onto the cabin roof to fix the chimney cap that had been displaced in the night's wind, and that he had come down from the roof without the repair accomplished, because his forearm had given out on the ladder, the rebuilt section of the wound failing under the grip load, and that he was bleeding through the bandage, and had also struck his shoulder on the ladder rail coming down, and that she needed Clara now. Clara was already moving. She had the medical kit off its shelf, the same kit she had carried through 30 years of rural nursing, maintained and replenished as she could manage, and her coat on, and she told Jeremiah to keep Lily inside to read the thermometer in 1 hour and write the number in the notebook and to not deviate from those instructions. Jeremiah looked at Lily. Lily looked at Jeremiah with the specific evaluating expression she used on new situations. He said, "I can do that." The walk to the Callaway cabin was 300 yards on level ground, which in negative 34-degree air with a medical kit was a different proposition than the same distance in any other condition. Clara moved fast and kept her face down and thought about nothing except the patient she was walking toward, which was the discipline she had always used to get herself from one emergency to the next, the strict present tense attention that left no room for the ambient fear that wanted in at the edges. Thomas Callaway was sitting on the cabin's main bench when she came through the door, his right arm held against his body in the self-protective posture of someone whose injury has begun to communicate to him in the language of real pain rather than the manageable discomfort of the previous weeks. He was pale but not gray. His lips were normal-colored. He was tracking her entry with alert eyes, which told her the most important thing first: the situation was serious but not immediately critical. She put the kit on the table and unwrapped the arm. The forearm wound had been fighting a slow-motion infection for weeks. She had known this, had been managing it through Ruth at a distance, had known the distance was a limitation. The impact on the ladder had torn the partially healed outer layer, and the tissue beneath it had the characteristics she had been watching for, the warm, tightly swollen quality that indicated the infection was not superficial. She cleaned it with the carbolic solution she had been conserving since October, working methodically and without hurry, because hurry and wound care produced additional trauma, and she had enough to work with already. Thomas stayed still with the stoic quality of a man who had spent years in mining work and had learned to separate pain from panic. She told him that the wound needed to be properly drained and packed, that it was going to be worse before it was better, and that worse before better was an infinitely better trajectory than what happened to infected forearm wounds in frontier conditions that were not properly managed. She asked if he understood. He said he understood. She did what needed to be done. Ruth stood at her shoulder through the entire procedure, watching with the focused attention she always brought to medical information, asking the questions she needed to ask at the appropriate pauses, not during the moments requiring both of Clara's hands. When it was finished and the arm was properly bandaged and elevated, Clara gave Ruth the rest of the carbolic solution with instructions for the schedule of cleaning over the following week, and she told her the specific signs that would mean the situation had exceeded what either of them could manage, and that Deadwood was no longer optional. They were the kind of women who functioned best when given accurate information and trusted to make good decisions from it. Clara had known this about Ruth since September. She had always been grateful for it. The walk back to the cave in the negative 34-degree air felt longer than the walk out. Not because Clara was tired, though she was, because the cold at that temperature had a weight to it that was physical. Something you moved through rather than simply moved in a medium that pushed back against forward motion with the quiet insistence of something that has been doing this for a very long time and does not regard your urgency as relevant. She kept her face down and her hands in her coat, and she moved. When she came through the cave door, the first thing she saw was Lily sitting cross-legged on the bed with the notebook open on her knees, pencil in hand, watching the thermometer on the wall with total absorption. The second thing she saw was Jeremiah sitting on the stone by the wall, with his coat still on, watching Lily watch the thermometer. And the expression on his face was one that Clara cataloged and did not comment on the expression of a man who has encountered something that has quietly rearranged his understanding of what endurance looks like. The third thing she saw was the temperature on the thermometer, 40 degrees. Jeremiah looked up when the door closed behind her. He said, "She has been doing it every 30 minutes. She told me you do it every hour, but she wanted to do it every 30 minutes to have more data." He paused. Her word, data. Clara looked at Lily. Lily looked back with the expression that was equal parts pride and the entirely justified confidence of someone who has been doing the job correctly. Clara said, "Show me the entries." Lily held up the notebook. 6 entries across 3 hours each in the child's careful, irregular numerals, each accurate to within a degree of what Clara read when she checked the thermometer herself. Clara looked at the column of numbers and felt something move through her that she did not name and did not attempt to examine in that moment because the situation did not have room for it. She said the second and fourth entries are 1 degree low. Everything else is correct. Lily studied the entries with a slight furrow of concentration. Then she nodded, accepting the correction with the precision that the notebook required. That night, with the outside temperature holding at -32, the cave held its 6 people with the same untroubled reliability with which it had held 2. Silas had arrived 2 hours after Clara returned from the Callaway cabin, coming in from the cold with his own cabin still intact, but having made the calculation that solo survival at this extreme was a problem best addressed by not being solo. He brought a section of dried venison wrapped in cloth and set it by the food stores without ceremony. The thermal mass advantage of the limestone and the water seam behind the back wall was not diminished by additional occupants. If anything, the presence of 6 living bodies added marginal warmth to the air, in a way that the thermometer read at midnight by Clara reflected 42 degrees, 2 degrees above the evening's baseline. 6 people breathing and existing in a space produced measurable warmth. She noted this in the notebook without comment. It was simply what the number said. The 6 of them organized themselves in the cave with the natural efficiency of people who have a single shared interest. Jeremiah took the floor near the stove. Ruth arranged herself beside Thomas on the far side of the raised bed, where his elevated arm could be maintained without strain. Silas sat against the right wall in a position from which he could see both the door and the ventilation gap simultaneously, which Clara noticed and found she trusted. She assigned Lily the task of sleeping. The child bargained for 1 more thermometer reading first, which Clara allowed, and then Lily curled against the wall side of the bed and was asleep in the particular swift way of children who have done all the things they needed to do. Clara sat with the notebook through the minor hours of the night, not sleeping, because the cave's population had increased by a factor of 3 and the protocol had not been designed for 6, and she needed to monitor the variables. She checked the ventilation gap every 2 hours, watching for the signs of CO2 accumulation, her own alertness, the quality of the others' breathing, the character of the lantern flame, which would burn differently in compromised air. She checked the temperature. She checked Thomas's arm twice quietly, without waking Ruth, running her fingers along the bandage in the dark to feel for the warmth of spreading infection. What she found both times was a wound behaving as a properly managed wound should. Warm but not hotter than the previous check, contained within its boundaries, not advancing. At 4 in the morning, when the temperature outside had reached what Silas would later confirm was the coldest recorded measurement on that stretch of French Creek in at least 15 years, Clara read the thermometer inside the cave, 39 degrees. The wood supply was being consumed at a rate she had not planned for 6 people's body heat, partially compensating for the higher stove demand, the net effect within manageable range. She fed the stove 2 logs pine because the need was for rapid heat generation rather than sustained slow release at this hour, and watched the flame accept them and sat back. The cave did not fail. It did not waver. It held with the absolute consistency of something built by geological time rather than human planning. And it held because Clara Whitmore had understood what it was and had aligned her system with its nature rather than working against it or worse, ignoring it. When gray light began to show at the ventilation gap, Silas woke without being woken the internal clock of a man who had been rising before dawn for 30 years. He looked at Clara, who had not moved from her position by the stove. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the woodpile. Then he looked back at Clara with the expression of a man finishing a calculation that had been running since July. His voice was level, carrying no drama, giving the words exactly the weight they deserved, and no more "I was wrong about you." Not just about the cave, about you. Clara looked at him for a moment. There was no victory in what she felt, no satisfaction of the kind that comes from being vindicated. There was something quieter and more valuable than vindication. The recognition that she had done the work correctly and that the work had held and that the people in the room with her were alive because of it. She said the cave was there for anyone who looked at it carefully. Silas shook his head slightly. He said the cave was there for everyone. You are the one who understood it. She did not answer that. The days following the extreme cold event carried the particular quality of aftermath, the silence that settles when something large has passed and people are taking inventory of what remains. The temperature rose gradually from its extreme low, recovering in stages over 5 days, each morning's reading slightly less punishing than the last. French Creek, fully frozen now in a way it had not been in December, would take several weeks to resume its normal movement. The slope above the cave, stripped of loose snow by the wind of the storm, showed the bare limestone face in long gray sections that looked, in the early morning light, like the exposed ribs of something ancient and patient. Thomas Calloway's arm continued to improve under the treatment protocol. Clara visited the cabin twice in the week following the storm, not because emergencies required it, but because the follow-through on a medical case was not optional when you were the practitioner of record. On her second visit, she examined the wound in good light and found it closing properly. The infection fully contained the tissue, beginning the organized repair that she had been working to create conditions for since September. She told Ruth what she was seeing and what it meant, and Ruth listened and then asked the follow-up question she always asked, the one that showed she was thinking about the trajectory and not just the current state. Ruth asked what the arm would need over the next month to finish healing correctly, and Clara told her, and Ruth repeated the information back with the precision of someone encoding it for permanent retention. Jeremiah Cole had returned to his own cabin when the temperature rose enough to make roof repair feasible, taking with him the empty notebook that Clara had produced from the bottom of her kit, a spare she had brought from her nursing supplies without quite knowing why. She had filled its first page with the core protocol in her own handwriting before she gave it to him: the firing sequence, the temperature targets, the ventilation requirement, the fuel calculation method. He had taken it with both hands, which she noticed, and had stood in the cave doorway, looking at it for a moment before he walked down the slope. Silas came back 3 times in the 2 weeks following the storm. Not for shelter. His cabin was intact, and with the methodology he was now applying, adequately warm. He came with questions, each time more sophisticated than the last, moving from the practical protocol to the underlying principles, to the question of how the principles would generalize to different cave configurations and different formation types. Clara answered each question as fully as she could, and on the 3rd visit she found herself asking him questions in return about the geology of the slope, about what other seam structures he had encountered in 20 years of mining work, about what he knew of the subsurface drainage patterns in the broader area. It became, that 3rd visit, a conversation between 2 people who had different kinds of knowledge and were discovering the places where they overlapped and the places where they did not. At the end of that 3rd visit, Silas stood at the cave entrance and looked out at the February landscape, the slope and the creek and the pale sky, and he said something that Clara wrote in the notebook that evening, not because she thought she would forget it, but because some things deserve the permanence of ink. 40 years in these hills, and I never thought to ask what the rock was doing. I was always trying to get through it, not work with it. She wrote it down and looked at it and thought about all the things she had spent 30 years of nursing trying to get through rather than work with the particular stubbornness of certain patients, the intractability of certain conditions, the way that fever could not be commanded but could be understood and met at its own level. The cave had not required her to be stronger than she was. It had required her to be precise. The letter from her brother arrived in the first week of March, carried up from the Deadwood Post by a man who delivered mail along the creek route twice a month. The handwriting on the envelope was James's, the same careful schoolhouse script he had used since childhood, and Clara held the envelope for a moment before opening it, not from hesitation, but from a specific quality of attention that she gave to things that were likely to change something. He had heard about the winter. Word traveled even across the distance between the Black Hills and Iowa, and the particular severity of the season had made it further than most local news. He wrote that he and Agnes had discussed the matter again and had reached a different conclusion than the previous letter, that there was room for her and for the child, that the fall baby that had been the obstacle was now arrived and healthy, and that Agnes had said in James's careful rendering of her words that the little girl ought to know her family. He wrote that he hoped she had made it through all right and that they would be glad to have her home. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. She read it twice, which was not something she usually did with letters, and then she sat and looked at the cave wall. The interior face with its limestone layers, the left rear corner, where the water seam ran behind the rock, warm and constant and entirely indifferent to seasons. She looked at the stove in its corner, Harold's stove, black and scarred and permanent. She looked at the notebook on the bed beside her, 563 entries across 8 months, a record of something that had never existed before and would not exist again in quite this form. Outside the cave entrance, she could hear Lily at the creek's edge, where the ice had pulled back enough in the rising temperatures to reveal a margin of cold water that the child was examining with her usual investigative gravity. Lily's voice came up the slope in fragments, not words Clara could fully parse at this distance, but the particular tone of a child talking to herself about something interesting, the internal monologue of a mind in active engagement with the world. Clara thought about Iowa. She thought about the farm outside Cedar Rapids, the solid house, and the solid rhythms of farming life, the grandchildren who were now Lily's cousins, and who would give her what children need most, which is other children. She thought about what it meant to grow up in a place where the winter was managed by other people, where the cold was a season rather than a problem to solve, where a child could be 4 and then 5 and then 12 without being required to learn that survival was a matter of careful observation and continuous adjustment. The cave was not a permanent home. She had known this since August had always known. It had never allowed herself to confuse the temporary necessity of the solution with the nature of the life she was building. The cave had served its purpose with a completeness that she had not allowed herself to fully feel until this moment, because feeling it while it was still needed would have been a distraction from the work. Now the work was essentially done. The winter had been survived. The child was healthy. The fuel supply after everything had lasted. She got up and went to the entrance and looked down at Lily by the creek. The child looked up at that moment, the specific timing that children have, as if they sense the quality of an adult's attention through some mechanism that adults lose track of. She held up a piece of pale stone she had found at the water's edge, limestone smooth edge the color of winter sky. Clara looked at the stone in the small hand, at the face of the child holding it at the creek, moving behind her in the thin pale light of early March. She called down the slope, "Come up and help me write something." Lily put the stone in her apron pocket and came up the slope in the deliberate climbing motion of a child who takes slopes seriously. The packing took 2 days. Clara moved with the economy of someone who had learned across the winter that every object either earned its presence or was dead weight, and she applied this principle to the packing the same way she had applied it to the fuel supply and the firing protocol. What they needed, they took. What they did not need, they left. The medical kit stayed with her. The notebook stayed with her. Harold's stove was the last thing loaded, rigged onto Bess's back with the rope system she had developed in August and refined since. Lily supervised this operation from a position 2 feet away, her limestone rock in her pocket, her face carrying the expression of someone ensuring that the most important things were handled correctly. Clara did not rush the last morning. She made a fire in the stove one final time, not for heat. The morning was cold but manageable, but because the stove deserved to be used properly to the end, rather than simply vacated. She made coffee and sat with it in the entrance, looking at French Creek and the slope and the pale sky, and she thought about nothing in particular, and everything in general, the way you think when you are at the hinge between 2 phases of a life. When the coffee was done, she put out the fire, carefully cleaned the ashtray, and latched the firebox door. Then she did the last thing. She carried the remaining firewood from the interior to the outer face of the wall, stacking it in two clean sections beside the entrance, pine on the left, oak on the right, with the natural order of someone for whom the separation of pine and oak had long since become instinctive. The stacks were tidy. They were substantial. Whoever came next would have enough to begin. She took the white chalk she had used to mark measurements on the wall during construction and stood at the right side of the entrance at the face of the stone that was most sheltered from weather, and she wrote in her careful medical script, pressing hard enough that the chalk would survive a season. Pine first. Oak after, 3 hours, then let the fire out. The stone does the rest. Check the thermometer every morning and write it down. C.W. Winter, 1883 to 84. She stood back and read it. Silas was at the base of the slope, having appeared without announcement in the way he had of arriving when something was concluding. Ruth stood beside him. Thomas was with her, his right arm in the sling Clara had fashioned from canvas, his color better than it had been in months. Jeremiah was there, which she had not expected, standing slightly apart in the manner of a man who is not certain whether he belongs to the moment, but has decided to be present for it anyway. Clara looked at all of them from the cave entrance. They looked back at her. Ruth came up the slope and stood beside her and looked at the writing on the stone, and then looked at the stacked wood, and then looked at Clara with the expression she had first worn in September when she had read the notebook and understood that what she was looking at was something different from what she had assumed. Ruth said, "Someone is going to come up here next winter, not knowing any of this, and they are going to find exactly what they need." Clara looked at the chalk writing. She thought about the 7 days of July temperature readings that had made the decision possible about the fire she had not lit in August, and the numbers that had vindicated the decision not to light it about the shoulder that had failed, and the calculations she had adjusted, and the margin she had rebuilt. She thought about 563 notebook entries and a 4-year-old child learning to read a thermometer. She thought about the water seam behind the back wall that had been there 1,000 years before she arrived, and would be there 1,000 years after the Earth's own warmth offered freely to anyone who understood it. She thought about the distinction between the cave's existence and her use of it, which was the distinction between a resource and an understanding. She said the cave was there for anyone. She paused. Knowing what to do with it, that part took work. She went down the slope. Lily walked beside her, one hand in Clara's, the other hand touching the limestone rock in her apron pocket at intervals in the way that children touch their most important possessions to confirm they are still there. At the base of the slope, Clara stopped once, not to look back, but to look forward at the trail ahead, at the bull, carrying everything that had been decided was worth carrying, at the morning light moving across the creek in the tentative way of early March light, not yet certain of its authority. Lily looked up at her. Clara looked down at the child, at the face that held her son, in the set of the jaw, and something else entirely, something new. Something that had come into being across a winter in a limestone cave above a frozen creek in the Black Hills of South Dakota, made in part by cold and in part by careful numbers, and in part by the simple, irreducible fact of endurance. She said, "All right." The words were for both of them. They walked. Behind them, the cave held its temperature. 39 degrees in the morning light, the stone radiating its quiet, constant warmth from the seam behind the back wall, the chalk writing visible against the gray limestone face, the pine and oak stacked neatly on either side of the entrance ready. The notebook was wedged into the crevice above the entrance, visible to anyone tall enough to look for it. 563 entries, 8 months of mornings, the record of a system understood from the inside and proven against the hardest winter in 15 years. It would outlast the chalk. It would outlast the wood. Whether it outlasted the winter and fell into the hands of someone who could use it was a matter that Clara had transferred to probability rather than control, which was the only honest relationship you could have with the future. She had done what she had come to understand she was responsible for doing. The rest belonged to whoever came next. The trail bent south toward the main road, and Lily asked whether rocks from South Dakota stayed themselves in a different place, and Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved and said that a rock was what it was, regardless of where you put it, that the properties that made it what it was had been set a very long time ago and were not subject to revision by geography. Lily appeared satisfied with this. Clara walked, and the morning opened ahead of them, and the Black Hills fell behind, and the long winter was finished.